For 28 years, I sacrificed everything for my son Damien, working double shifts, skipping meals, wearing the same worn clothes for years just so he could have a better life. But the moment I walked through his door in Riverside Heights and told him I'd lost my job at the textile factory, his response shattered my heart. "You're nothing but a financial burden, mother. Find somewhere else to live." What he didn't know was that my late friend Victoria had left me a fortune worth $12 million, and his cruelty was about to cost him everything he thought he was entitled to. Hold up, I'm curious where you're listening from. And if this story spoke to you, make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, what I have planned for tomorrow is going to blow you away. My name is Eleanor Winters, and I'm 62 years old. For nearly 3 decades, I've been the invisible foundation holding up my son's life, though he's never seen it that way. While other mothers my age were planning retirement trips or spoiling grandchildren, I was still working 70-hour weeks at Thornfield Textile Mill in the industrial district of Millbrook, sending every spare dollar to support Damien and his wife Cassandra in their upscale neighborhood. The day everything changed started like any other. I woke up at 4:30 a.m. in my small studio apartment on Maple Street, the kind of place where the radiator clings all night and the walls are thin enough to hear every argument from the neighbors. I'd lived there for 8 years, ever since Damien got married, and I sold my modest 2-bedroom house to help him with the down payment on his dream home, a sprawling colonial in Riverside Heights that I could never afford to visit too often. Because even the gas money was a stretch, I dressed in my work uniform, the same navy blue polo shirt I'd been wearing for years, now faded and soft from countless washes, and caught the 5:45 a.m. bus to the factory. The commute took an hour and 20 minutes each way, but I never complained. Every hour I worked was an hour closer to helping Damien achieve the life I'd never had. At Thornfield, I was employee number 247, working in the quality control department. For 12 years, I'd inspected thousands of yards of fabric, standing on my feet for 10-hour shifts, my lower back constantly aching but my determination never wavering. My supervisor, Mr. Harrison, often commented that I was the most reliable worker they'd ever had. "Eleanor never calls in sick, never complains, never causes problems," he'd tell the younger employees. That's the kind of work ethic that built this country. But that Tuesday morning in March, Mr. Harrison's face looked different when he called me into his office. Gone was his usual gruff but friendly demeanor, replaced by something that looked almost like guilt. "Eleanor, I need you to sit down," he said, gesturing to the worn chair across from his desk. My heart started racing. In 12 years, I'd never been called into his office for anything serious. "The corporate office made some decisions," he continued, avoiding my eyes. "They're downsizing the quality control department, consolidating operations with the facility in Tampa. I'm sorry, Eleanor, but your position is being eliminated effective immediately." The words hit me like a physical blow. Eliminated. After 12 years of perfect attendance, 12 years of arriving early and staying late, 12 years of building my entire life around this job, I was being eliminated. Is there anything else available?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Harrison shook his head sadly. "I wish there was. You'll get 2 weeks severance pay and your accrued vacation time." "I know it's not much, but 2 weeks?" I interrupted, the reality crashing over me. "I have rent, utilities, groceries, and I help my son with his mortgage payments." He looked genuinely pained. "Eleanor, I've been in this business for 30 years, and you're one of the finest employees I've ever supervised. I'll write you the strongest recommendation letter you've ever seen. But the truth is, most factories are downsizing these days. At your age." He trailed off, but we both knew what he meant. I walked out of Thornfield Textile Mill that day carrying A small cardboard box with my personal items, a coffee mug Damien had given me for Mother's Day 10 years ago, a small plant I'd kept on my workstation, and a framed photo of Damien and Cassandra from their wedding day. The weight of that box felt heavier than all the fabric I'd lifted over the years combined. The bus ride home felt endless. I stared out the window at the gray March landscape, my mind racing with calculations. Rent was due in 2 weeks. The electricity bill was overdue. And Damien's mortgage payment, the $800 I contributed every month, was due in 10 days. Without my factory income, I had maybe $300 in my checking account and nothing in savings. I'd never been able to save because every dollar went to keeping afloat and helping my son. When I got home to my studio apartment, I sat on my small couch, the same one I'd bought secondhand 15 years ago, and stared at my phone. I had to tell Damien. He needed to know that his supplemental mortgage payment would be late this month, maybe longer until I found new work, but more than that, I needed my son. After 28 years of putting him first, after sacrificing my own comfort and security for his success, I needed him to offer me the same support I'd always given him. I had no idea that the conversation I was about to have would reveal just how little those 28 years of sacrifice had meant to him. What I also didn't know, what no one knew except Victoria's lawyer, was that 3 months earlier, my dear friend Victoria Ashford had passed away peacefully in her sleep, leaving behind a will that would change my life forever. Victoria had been the head librarian at Millbrook Public Library for 40 years, and we'd become close friends during my evening visits there. When I'd check out books to read during my lunch breaks at the factory, Victoria never married, never had children, and had lived a modest life in a small cottage on Elm Street. What no one realized was that Victoria had inherited a significant trust fund from her grandfather, a fund she'd never touched, letting it grow and compound for decades. She'd watched me struggle, watched me sacrifice, watched me give everything I had to a son who barely acknowledged my existence, and in her final act of friendship, she'd made sure that my years of selfless devotion would finally be rewarded, even if it would take a while for me to discover it. But first, I had to make that phone call to Damien. I had to tell my son that his mother, the woman who'd given him everything, had lost her job and needed his help for the first time in 28 years. I had no idea that his response would be the catalyst that would finally open my eyes to who he really was, and give me the strength to reclaim the life I'd spent decades giving away. We poured our hearts into researching and telling this story. If you're hooked, show some love with a subscribe. Now, where were we? With trembling fingers, I dialed Damien's number. My heart pounded as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. When he finally answered, his voice carried that familiar tone of impatience he reserved for interruptions during his workday. "Mom, this better be quick. I'm in between meetings." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "Damien, I need to tell you something important. I lost my job today. The factory is closing my department, and you what?" His voice shot up an octave, cutting me off mid-sentence. "How could you lose your job? You've been there for years." "It wasn't my fault, sweetheart. They're downsizing, eliminating positions." Mr. Harrison said. "I don't care what Mr. Harrison said." Damien's voice grew louder, angrier. "Do you have any idea what this means? Cassandra and I are already stretched thin with the mortgage, the car payments, her student loans. We were counting on your contribution." The words stung like a slap. Not once did he ask if I was okay, if I was scared, if I needed support. His first and only concern was how my job loss would affect his finances. "I know this is difficult timing," I said carefully, "but I was hoping maybe I could stay with you and Cassandra for a few weeks while I look for new work. Just until I get back on my feet. Stay with us?" Damien's laugh was harsh, bitter. "Mom, we don't have room for house guests. Besides, Cassandra is trying to get pregnant, and she needs a stress-free environment. Having you here, unemployed and depressed, wouldn't exactly be ideal. I felt my chest tighten. House guest? Is that what I was to my own son? Damien, I'm not talking about being a house guest. I'm your mother. I helped you buy that house, remember? I gave you my life savings for the down payment. That was your choice, he snapped. Nobody forced you to do that. And frankly, Mom, that house is in Cassandra's and my name. You don't have any claim to it just because you decided to help out years ago. I stood up from my couch, pacing the small space of my studio apartment, the phone pressed tightly to my ear. I'm not claiming ownership, Damien. I'm asking my son for help during the most difficult time of my life. Look, Mom, I'm going to be honest with you because somebody needs to be. You're 62 years old. You've had decades to build a career, to save money, to plan for retirement. The fact that you're still living paycheck to paycheck in a studio apartment isn't my responsibility to fix. His words felt like knives twisting in my stomach. Every sacrifice I'd made, every opportunity I'd given up to support his dreams, every dollar I'd sent him instead of saving for my own future, none of it mattered to him now. I lived paycheck to paycheck because I was supporting you, I said, my voice beginning to shake. Every time you needed money for college, for your wedding, for your house, for your car repairs, I was there. I never said no. And I appreciate that, I really do. But Mom, that's what parents are supposed to do. That's your job. You don't get to cash in those chips now and expect me to take care of you forever. The silence stretched between us. In that moment, I felt something inside me crack, not just my heart, but something deeper. The illusion I'd been living under for 28 years, the belief that my love and sacrifice had created a bond that would be there when I needed it most. So what exactly are you suggesting I do? I asked quietly. I'm suggesting you figure it out like an adult. There are programs for people in your situation. Senior housing, government assistance, maybe one of those companies that hire older workers. McDonald's is always hiring. At least you'd have some income coming in. McDonald's. My son was suggesting I work at McDonald's after 12 years of factory labor, after decades of supporting his every dream and ambition. I can't believe you just said that to me. Mom, I'm being practical. You need to start thinking realistically about your situation instead of expecting other people to solve your problems. Other people? My voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm. I'm not asking other people, Damien. I'm asking my son. The son I raised alone after your father left. The son I worked 3 jobs to put through college. The son whose wedding I paid for even though I had to take out a loan to do it. That was all your choice, he shouted back. I didn't ask you to work 3 jobs. I didn't ask you to pay for my wedding. You made those decisions because you wanted to, and now you're trying to make me feel guilty about it. I sank back onto my couch, feeling suddenly exhausted. I made those decisions because I loved you. Well, love doesn't pay the bills, Mom. Cassandra and I have our own lives to worry about. We're trying to start a family, we have career goals, we have financial responsibilities. We can't be expected to support you too. The casual cruelty of his words took my breath away. Support me too? Damien, for 28 years, I supported you. I never asked for anything in return. This is the first time, the very first time, I've ever needed help. And I've given you advice. Look into senior programs, find a job you can handle at your age, maybe downsize to an even cheaper apartment. There are solutions that don't involve disrupting our lives. Disrupting your lives, I repeated slowly. Is that what I would be doing? Look, Mom, I don't want to hurt your feelings, but yes. Cassandra barely tolerates your visits as it is. She thinks you're too dependent on me. Having you move in, even temporarily, would put a strain on our marriage. I closed my eyes, feeling tears threaten. What does Cassandra think of me? Damien was quiet for a moment, and I could practically hear him realizing he'd said too much. It doesn't matter what she thinks. It matters to me. Tell me. He sighed heavily. She thinks you never learn to be independent. She thinks you use guilt and obligation to manipulate me into sending you money every month. She's not wrong, Mom. The words hit me like a physical blow. Manipulation? Guilt? I thought about every phone call I'd made to Damien over the years, every conversation where I'd carefully avoided asking for anything for myself, where I'd focused only on his needs, his happiness, his success. I have never asked you for money. Damien. Never once. You didn't have to ask. You just made it clear that you couldn't make ends meet without help, and what was I supposed to do? Let my mother become homeless? So helping me was a burden to you. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. I stood up again, looking around my small apartment, the place I'd called home for 8 years because it was all I could afford after giving everything else to him. Damien, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. What? If I can't find work soon, if I can't make rent next month, what would you want me to do? The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Mom? I'm here. There are places, facilities, for people in your situation. Clean, safe places where you could have your own room, meals provided, activities with other residents your age. It might actually be better for you than struggling alone in that apartment. Facilities. He was talking about putting me in a home. You want to put me in a nursing home. It's not a nursing home, Mom. It's assisted living. Senior housing. There's a difference. And who would pay for this assisted living? Another long pause. There are programs. Government assistance. Maybe if you sold your few belongings, used any savings you have left. What savings, Damien? What belongings? I have a 10-year-old television, a 15-year-old couch, and about $300 in my checking account. Everything else went to you. That's not my fault. Those 4 words hung in the air between us like a verdict. That's not my fault. 28 years of sacrifice, and my son's response to my crisis was that my poverty wasn't his fault. You're right, I said quietly. It's not your fault. It's mine. Mom, I didn't mean, no, Damien. You're absolutely right. It's my fault. For believing that love and sacrifice would mean something. It's my fault for thinking that being a good mother would create a bond strong enough to survive hard times. It's my fault for expecting my son to care whether his mother ends up on the street. You're being dramatic. Am I? You've made it very clear that you have no room for me in your life, no desire to help me, and no guilt about watching me lose everything while you live in the house I helped you buy. I never asked you to help buy the house. But you took the money, didn't you? You took every dollar I offered, every sacrifice I made, every opportunity one gave up for your benefit. You took it all, and now you're telling me that taking it meant nothing. I could hear Cassandra's voice in the background, asking who he was talking to, her tone sharp with annoyance. Look, Mom, I have to go. Cassandra needs me to help her with something. We'll talk about this later when you've calmed down. No, I said firmly. We won't. What do you mean? For the first time in 28 years, I felt something shift inside me. A door closing on one chapter of my life, and another door, one I hadn't even known existed, beginning to crack open. I mean exactly what I said, Damien. We won't be talking about this later. In fact, we won't be talking at all. And with that, I hung up the phone. I sat in the silence of my small apartment, staring at the framed photo of Damien and Cassandra on my coffee table. For 28 years, that photo had represented everything I was working toward, their happiness, their success, their bright future. Now it just looked like a picture of two strangers who had taken everything I had to give and offered nothing. In return, what Damien didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that in exactly 3 days, Victoria's lawyer would be calling me with news that would change everything. But even if I'd known about the inheritance in that moment, I'm not sure it would have hurt any less to discover that my son saw me as nothing more than a burden to be discarded when I was no longer useful. The cruelest part wasn't that he had money problems of his own, the cruelest part was that he simply didn't care whether I lived or died. As long as it didn't inconvenience him. 3 days after I hung up on Damien, my phone rang at exactly 9 a.m. The caller ID showed Pemberton and Associates law firm, and for a moment, I wondered if this was about some debt I'd forgotten about. With everything falling apart, I almost didn't answer. Mrs. Winters? This is Attorney James Pemberton. I represent the estate of Victoria Ashford. Do you have a moment to speak? Victoria. My dear friend Victoria, who had passed away 3 months ago. I'd attended her small funeral service, one of only a dozen people there to say goodbye to the kindest woman I'd ever known. Of course, Mr. Pemberton. How can I help you? Actually, Mrs. Winters, I'm calling because Victoria mentioned you quite frequently in her will. She left specific instructions that I was to contact you exactly 90 days after her passing. Today marks that date. I sat down heavily on my couch, confused. I don't understand. Victoria and I were friends, but she barely had anything. She lived so modestly, worked at the library her whole life. Mrs. Winters, I think you'll need to come to my office. There are some things Victoria wanted you to know, and this conversation really needs to happen in person. Would this afternoon work for you? Something in his tone made my stomach flutter with an emotion I couldn't identify. Mr. Pemberton, is everything all right? Am I in some kind of trouble? He chuckled softly. No, Mrs. Winters. Quite the opposite. Actually. Can you be here at 2 p.m.? I spent the morning in a daze, riding the bus to the law offices in downtown Millbrook. Pemberton and Associates occupied the entire 15th floor of the Meridian building, the kind of place where I'd cleaned office buildings years ago but never imagined entering as a client. Mr. Pemberton was a distinguished man in his 60s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He led me to his office, which had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Mrs. Winters, please sit down. What I'm about to tell you will come as quite a shock. He opened a thick folder and pulled out several documents. Victoria Ashford was not just a librarian, Mrs. Winters. Her grandfather, Theodore Ashford, founded Ashford Mining Company in 1923. When he died in 1987, he left a substantial trust fund to Victoria, his only surviving heir. I stared at him blankly. I don't understand. Victoria lived in that tiny cottage, drove that old Honda, wore the same cardigan to work for years. Yes, she chose to live very simply. The trust fund was managed by our firm for over 30 years, growing through careful investments. Victoria never touched the principal, living entirely on her librarian's salary. She wanted to live an authentic life, she said, not one built on inherited wealth. Mr. Pemberton pulled out another document. However, Victoria was very specific about what should happen to that money after her death. She spent considerable time observing the people in her life, watching how they treated others, how they handled adversity. She was particularly moved by your friendship, Mrs. Winters. Our friendship? She documented everything, Mrs. Winters. How you worked double shifts but still came to the library every evening to read. How you never complained about your circumstances, never asked for anything, never showed jealousy toward others who had more. How you sacrificed everything for your son's education and future. My throat felt tight. She noticed all that? She noticed everything. She also noticed how your son treated you. His expression grew serious. Victoria was quite disturbed by some of the phone conversations she overheard when you visited the library. The way he spoke to you, the demands he made, the lack of gratitude he showed. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. I hadn't realized anyone had witnessed those painful conversations. Mrs. Winters, Victoria left you everything. The entire trust fund, along with her house and all her possessions. After taxes and fees, you're inheriting approximately $12 million. The words hit me like a physical force. I actually gripped the arms of my chair to keep from falling over. 12 million. 12.3 million, to be precise. But that's not all. He pulled out another document. Victoria was very specific about the conditions. She wanted to ensure you had time to process this information and make thoughtful decisions about your future. The inheritance includes a provision that allows you to remain anonymous if you choose, and she's given you complete control over how and when you reveal this information to others. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what I was hearing. 3 days ago, I'd been an unemployed factory worker facing homelessness. Now I was being told I was a millionaire. There's something else, Mrs. Winters. Victoria wrote you a personal letter. She insisted I give it to you after explaining the financial details. With shaking hands, I took the envelope he offered. Inside, in Victoria's neat handwriting, was a letter that would change everything. My dear Eleanor, if you're reading this, then James has explained about the inheritance. I hope you're sitting down. For 5 years, I watched you visit the library every evening after your factory shifts. I saw you study job training manuals, hoping to improve your situation. I witnessed the phone calls where your son demanded money, criticized your choices, and showed no appreciation for your sacrifices. I saw you give him your last $20 for his anniversary dinner while you ate peanut butter sandwiches for a week. I also saw your character. Your kindness to other library patrons, your patience with difficult people, your quiet dignity in the face of hardship. You never once complained about your circumstances or expressed bitterness toward those who had more. This money has been sitting unused for decades while good people like you struggle. I want you to have the life you deserve, Eleanor. More importantly, I want you to have the power to make your own choices about the people in your life. Use this gift wisely, my dear friend. And remember, you owe nothing to anyone who couldn't see your worth when you had nothing to offer but yourself. With love and respect, Victoria *. I was crying before I finished reading. Mr. Pemberton quietly handed me a box of tissues and waited, while I collected myself. What do I need to do? I asked finally. Nothing immediate. The funds have already been transferred to accounts in your name. Victoria's house is now yours as well. It's much larger than it appeared from the outside. By the way, she had extensive renovations done over the years but kept the exterior modest. You can move in whenever you're ready. The house too? 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a beautiful garden, and completely paid off. Victoria wanted you to have options. Mrs. Winters. You can live there, sell it, rent it out, whatever suits your needs. I left the law office in a daze, carrying documents that represented more money than I'd ever imagined possessing. The bus ride home felt surreal. I kept expecting to wake up from an impossible dream, but this was real. Victoria, dear Victoria, had given me more than money, she'd given me freedom. That evening, I sat in my studio apartment looking at the documents spread across my small table. Bank statements showing account balances I could barely comprehend. Property deeds for Victoria's house. Investment portfolios that generated more income in a month than I'd earned in a year at the factory. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't have to worry about money. I didn't have to fear eviction, or choose between groceries and utilities, or send my last dollars to ungrateful relatives, but more than that, I had power now. Real power. I thought about my phone conversation with Damien 3 days earlier. His casual cruelty, his suggestion that I work at McDonald's, his willingness to put me in a nursing home rather than let me stay in the house I'd helped him buy. What would he say if he knew about this inheritance? Would he suddenly remember that he loved me? Would Cassandra decide I wasn't such a burden after all? The thought made me smile for the first time in days, but then I remembered Victoria's letter, "You owe nothing to anyone who couldn't see your worth when you had nothing to offer but yourself." She was right. Damien had shown me exactly who he was when he thought I was powerless and penniless. Why would I want to give him access to this new life Victoria had gifted me? Instead, I began to think about something else entirely. Something that would show Damien exactly what his cruelty had cost him, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted him to understand the true value of what he'd thrown away. I picked up my phone and called Mr. Pemberton. Mr. Pemberton. It's Eleanor Winters. I have a question about the inheritance. Is there any requirement that I tell my family about this immediately? None whatsoever, Mrs. Winters. Victoria was very clear that all decisions about disclosure are entirely yours to make. Good. And the house, when can I see it? Tomorrow, if you'd like. I have the keys right here. Perfect. And Mr. Pemberton? I'd like to discuss setting up some strategic arrangements. I have some debts I'd like to pay off, but I want to do it in a very specific way. Of course. What did you have in mind? As I explained my plan, I could hear the approval in Mr. Pemberton's voice. Victoria had chosen her heir well. By the time I hung up the phone, I was no longer Eleanor Winters, the desperate factory worker begging for her son's help. I was Eleanor Winters, millionaire. And I was about to teach some very important people what it meant to take someone's love for granted. The best part? They had no idea what was coming. 2 weeks after receiving my inheritance, I stood in the marble foyer of Victoria's house, my house now, watching through the window as a black Mercedes pulled into the circular driveway. Right on time, the house was even more magnificent than Mr. Pemberton had described. What appeared from the street to be a modest cottage was actually a sprawling estate that had been expertly designed to look unassuming from the front. Behind the simple facade lay 6,000 square feet of elegant living space, with soaring ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and French doors that opened onto terraced gardens. Victoria had lived like royalty while dressing like a librarian, and now this palace was mine. I smoothed down my new dress, a designer piece I'd purchased that morning for $800 without blinking, and opened the front door before my visitors could ring the bell. Damien stood on my doorstep looking confused and slightly irritated, with Cassandra beside him wearing her usual expression of barely concealed disdain. They'd both dressed up for this mysterious meeting I'd requested, though I could tell they were annoyed at having to drive across town to what they assumed was some modest rental I'd found after our last conversation. Mom? Damien's eyes darted. passed me into the house, taking in the Italian marble floors and crystal chandelier visible in the entryway. "What is this place? You said you wanted to meet at your new home, but this can't be. Did you take a job as a live-in housekeeper again?" "Hello, Damien." "Cassandra." I stepped back and gestured them inside. "Please, come in. We have a lot to discuss." They entered hesitantly, their eyes wide as they took in the opulent surroundings. The living room I led them to featured a massive stone fireplace, antique Persian rugs, and oil paintings that were probably worth more than most people's cars. "Mom, seriously, what is this place?" Damien's voice had risen an octave. "Whose house is this?" "It's mine," I said simply, settling into a velvet armchair that had probably cost more than my old monthly rent. Cassandra let out a sharp laugh. "Yours?" "Eleanor, please. You lost your job 2 weeks ago. You were practically begging us to let you sleep on our couch. There's no way you could afford a place like this." "You're absolutely right, Cassandra. 2 weeks ago, I couldn't have afforded this. But circumstances have changed rather dramatically." I reached for a folder I'd placed on the coffee table, the same mahogany table where Victoria used to serve tea to her few close friends. Inside were copies of all the documents Mr. Pemberton had given me, carefully organized for maximum impact. "You see, my dear friend Victoria, you remember Victoria from the library, passed away 3 months ago. It turns out she left me a small inheritance." "How small?" Damien asked, his tone suddenly sharp with interest. I pretended to consult the documents. "Oh, roughly $12.3 million. Plus this house, of course." The silence that followed was deafening. Cassandra's mouth literally fell open. Damien blinked rapidly, as if trying to process information that didn't compute. 12 million? Damien's voice was barely a whisper. "Million," I confirmed cheerfully. The lawyers were quite thorough about the decimal places. Cassandra found her voice first. "That's impossible. Nobody leaves that kind of money to a factory worker." "You're lying." I turned the bank statements toward them, letting them see the account balances for themselves. Damien leaned forward, his eyes scanning the numbers with the intensity of a man studying lottery tickets. "This is real," he said slowly. "Mom, this is actually real. Very real. Would you like to see the investment portfolios as well?" The lawyers explained that I'm earning approximately $30,000 per month just in interest and dividends. Apparently, I never need to work again. The transformation in both their faces was immediate and nauseating. The dismissive coldness melted away, replaced by calculating smiles and suddenly warm tones. "Mom, this is incredible." Damien jumped up from his chair and moved toward me as if to embrace me. "Congratulations. I can't believe you've been keeping this secret for 2 weeks. I held up a hand, stopping him mid-approach. "Sit down, Damien." Something in my tone made him freeze. The smile faltered on his face as he slowly returned to his seat. "Now, I imagine you're both wondering why I asked you here today instead of simply calling with this news. We're just so happy for you, Eleanor," Cassandra said, her voice dripping with sudden sweetness. "This must be such a relief after all your financial struggles." Relief. Yes, that's one word for it. I leaned back in my chair, studying their faces. "Tell me, Cassandra, what exactly did you say about me to Damien after our last phone conversation?" She glanced nervously at Damien. I don't recall saying anything specific, really? Because Damien mentioned that you barely tolerate my visits. That you think I'm too dependent on him. That having me stay with you, even temporarily, would strain your marriage. Did I get that right, Damien? My son's face had gone pale. Mom. You're taking that out of context. We were stressed, we said things we didn't mean, oh, but you did mean them. That's what made it so illuminating. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a recording app. In fact, I found our conversation so educational that I recorded it. Would you like to hear it again? The color drained completely from Damien's face. You recorded our phone call? Just the relevant parts. The part where you suggested I work at McDonald's, for instance. Or when you recommended I look into senior housing facilities. My personal favorite was when you said love doesn't pay the bills. Cassandra was staring at Damien with a mixture of horror and fury. Clearly, he hadn't shared the full extent of his cruelty with his wife. But my absolute favorite moment, I continued, was when you said it wasn't your fault that I was poor. Do you remember that, Damien? Mom, please, let me explain, no need to explain. You were quite clear. You made it very obvious that you saw no obligation to help your mother in her time of need. You made it clear that my 28 years of sacrifice meant nothing to you. You made it clear that I was, in your words, a burden you couldn't be expected to carry. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the manicured gardens. So I've been thinking about that conversation quite a lot over the past 2 weeks. And I've realized you were absolutely right about one thing. What's that? Damien's voice was barely audible. Love doesn't pay the bills. But you know what does? $12.3 million. I turned back to face them. Which brings me to why I asked you here today. I wanted to personally thank you both for showing me exactly who you are when you thought I had nothing left to offer. Eleanor, Cassandra started, her voice shaking, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Oh, there's been no misunderstanding. You both made your positions crystal clear. I was a burden, a strain on your marriage, someone who needed to figure out her own problems like an adult. Well, congratulations. I've figured them out. Damien was leaning forward now, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. Mom, I know I said some harsh things, but I was under pressure. The mortgage payments, Cassandra's student loans, the stress of trying to start a family, the mortgage payments, I interrupted. Yes, let's talk about those. The $800 you were so worried about losing when I lost my job. I walked back to my chair and pulled out another document. I've been going through my financial records with Mr. Pemberton, my lawyer. Did you know that over the past 5 years, I've given you approximately $48,000 to help with your mortgage? Damien's jaw dropped. $48,800 a month for 5 years. $48,000. From a woman making $12 an hour at a textile factory. Money I could have been saving for my own retirement, my own emergencies, my own future. We never asked you to, you never asked me not to either. You took that money every month without question, without gratitude, and apparently without any sense that it created even the smallest obligation on your part to help me when I needed it. Cassandra was fidgeting with her purse strap, her eyes darting between Damien and me. Eleanor, if we had known about your inheritance, obviously we would have handled things differently, would you? Would you really? Or would you have just been nicer to me because you knew I had money? I tilted my head, genuinely curious. Tell me, Cassandra, what exactly would you have done differently if you'd known I was wealthy? She opened her mouth, then closed it, clearly realizing there was no good answer to that question. The truth is, I continued, you would have treated me well because I had something you wanted, not because I deserved basic human decency. That's not love, that's not family, that's just greed with better manners. Damien suddenly stood up, his face flushed with desperation. Mom, please. Yes, I said terrible things. Yes, I was cruel and ungrateful. But I'm your son. We can work through this. I can change, I can be better, can you? Because 2 weeks ago, when you thought I was a broke, unemployed factory worker, facing homelessness, you couldn't even offer me a place to sleep for a few nights. But now that you know I'm worth $12 million, suddenly you want to work through our issues? People make mistakes when they're under stress. This wasn't a mistake, Damien. This was a choice. You chose to prioritize your comfort over my survival. You chose to see me as a burden rather than your mother. You chose to protect your lifestyle rather than help the woman who sacrificed everything to give you that lifestyle in the first place. I walked to the front door and opened it, the cool afternoon air flowing into the foyer. So now I'm making a choice too. I'm choosing to protect my peace over your proximity. I'm choosing my dignity over your guilt. I'm choosing to surround myself with people who valued me when I had nothing, rather than people who suddenly find me valuable now that I have everything. Mom, you can't be serious. Damien's voice cracked. I'm your son. You can't just cut me out of your life over one phone conversation. One conversation that revealed 28 years of taking me for granted. One conversation that showed me exactly what our relationship really was, a one-way transaction where I gave and you took, over and over again, until there was nothing left to take. I gestured toward the open door. You both made it very clear that you didn't want me in your lives when you thought I was poor. Well, good news, now that I'm rich, I don't want you in mine. They stared at me in shock, as if they couldn't quite believe what they were hearing. Please leave my house now, I said quietly. And don't come back. As they walked past me toward their car, I heard Cassandra hiss at Damien, how could you be so stupid? $12 million, and you threw it away for what? But Damien didn't answer. He just kept walking, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling something I hadn't experienced in decades, complete and utter freedom. For the first time in 28 years, I owed nothing to anyone who didn't deserve it. 6 months after that confrontation. In my living room, I stood in the sunroom of my estate, watering the orchids I'd planted in Victoria's honor. The morning light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting rainbows across the marble floors, and I couldn't help but smile at how perfectly peaceful my life had become. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but it had been more profound than I ever could have imagined. For the first time in my adult life, I woke up each morning with no anxiety about bills, no stress about making ends meet, and no phone calls from ungrateful relatives demanding my time, energy, or money.my. Days were my own now. I'd hired a wonderful housekeeper named Maria, not because I couldn't clean my own home, but because I could finally afford to pay someone else fairly for work I'd done my entire life for barely enough to survive. Maria was a single mother of 2, working 3 jobs before I hired her full-time at a salary that allowed her to quit her other positions and actually spend evenings with her children. Mrs. Winters, Maria called from the kitchen, Mr. Pemberton is here for your 10 o'clock appointment. Thank you, Maria. Please show him to the study. Mr. Pemberton had become more than just my lawyer over these past months, he'd become a trusted advisor helping me navigate my new life. Today's meeting was about the foundation I'd decided to establish in Victoria's memory. Eleanor, he greeted me with a warm smile as I entered the study. You look wonderful. Retirement suits you. I laughed, settling into the leather chair behind what had once been Victoria's desk. Retirement at 62. Victoria would have found that amusing, considering she worked at the library until she was 78. She worked because she loved it, not because she had to. There's a difference. He spread several documents across the desk. I have the paperwork for the Victoria Ashford Foundation. Your initial funding of $5 million will allow us to help dozens of families in situations similar to what yours was. The foundation was designed to assist working-class families facing sudden hardships, job losses, medical emergencies, unexpected expenses that could destroy carefully balanced budgets. Rather than just giving handouts, we provided temporary support while helping people develop long-term stability. The first recipients have been selected, Mr. Pemberton continued. There's a factory worker in Riverside whose husband was injured in a car accident. A single mother who lost her job when her company downsized. An elderly man whose pension was eliminated when his former employer went bankrupt. Stories that could have been my own. Stories of good people facing circumstances beyond their control, with nowhere to turn for help. Perfect. And the scholarship program at Millbrook Community College? Fully established. The Victoria Ashford Scholarship will provide full tuition for adult learners returning to school after age 50. The first recipients start classes this fall. As Mr. Pemberton gathered his papers, my phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it and wasn't surprised to see Damien's name on the screen. Mom, please. Cassandra left me. I lost the house. I need help. The IT was the 7th message he'd sent this month. They'd been arriving regularly since word got out in Millbrook about my inheritance. Small towns don't keep secrets long, especially ones involving millions of dollars. The first few messages had been angry, demanding explanations for why I'd hidden the money from him. Then came attempts at guilt, reminders of our family bond, mentions of how much he always loved me, promises that he'd changed. Now they were just desperate. I deleted the message without responding, just as I had with all the others. Still hearing from your son? Mr. Pemberton asked gently. Occasionally. Less frequently now that he realizes I'm not going to respond. Any regrets about your decision? I considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, when I'd first thrown Damien and Cassandra out of my house, I'd wondered if I was being too harsh. After all, he was still my son, regardless of how he treated me, but then I'd remembered Victoria's letter, you owe nothing to anyone who couldn't see your worth when you had nothing to offer but yourself. None, I said firmly. He showed me exactly who he was when he thought I was powerless. Why would I want someone like that in my life just because I now have power? The truth was, cutting ties with Damien had been the most liberating decision I'd ever made. Without the constant drain of his demands and criticism, without the monthly payments that kept me living paycheck to paycheck, without the emotional exhaustion of trying to earn love from someone incapable of giving it, I'd discovered who Eleanor Winters really was when she wasn't defined by other people's needs. I was curious, for one thing. With money no longer a concern, I'd started taking classes, art history at the community college, cooking lessons from a chef in town, piano lessons I'd always dreamed of but never been able to afford. I was generous, but wisely so. Instead of giving money to people who felt entitled to it, I was helping strangers who genuinely needed it and appreciated every bit of assistance they received. I was social in ways I'd never been able to be before. When you're working 70 hours a week just to survive, you don't have time for friendships or hobbies or community involvement. Now I volunteered at the library where Victoria had worked, served on the board of the local food bank, and had even joined a book club that met monthly at members' homes. Most surprisingly, I was dating Dr. Robert Chin, a retired professor who'd moved to Millbrook after his wife passed away, had asked me to dinner 3 months ago. We'd met at the library, where he was researching local history for a book he was writing. Robert knew nothing about my money when he first approached me. He'd simply seen an interesting woman reading Tolstoy in the poetry section and struck up A conversation about Russian literature. When I eventually told him about my inheritance, his reaction had been wonderful. How amazing that you can help so many people now. Not how can I benefit from this, not what does this mean for me, just genuine happiness that I had the resources to make a difference in the world. That afternoon, I drove to the Riverside Heights neighborhood where Damien had lived with Cassandra. I'd heard through Mr. Pemberton that the house had gone into foreclosure after Cassandra left and Damien could no longer afford the mortgage payments without her income and my monthly contributions. The for sale sign in the front yard now had a red sold banner across it. I wondered who the new owners would be, whether they'd appreciate the beautiful kitchen I'd helped pay for, the hardwood floors my factory wages had helped installed. I felt no sadness looking at it. That house represented a version of myself I no longer recognized, a woman so desperate to be loved that she'd bankrupt herself trying to buy affection from people who saw her as nothing more than a source of income. As I drove home to my estate, my phone rang. Robert's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with a smile. Eleanor, how was your meeting with the lawyer? Wonderful. The foundation paperwork is complete, and we're ready to start helping families. That's fantastic. Victoria would be so proud of what you're doing in her memory. His voice grew warmer. Are we still on for dinner tonight? I made reservations at that new Italian place downtown. Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it. Good. I have something I want to discuss with you. Oh. What's that? I'll tell you tonight. But, Eleanor, I think you're going to like it. After we hung up, I found myself curious about what Robert wanted to discuss. In our 3 months of dating, he'd proven to be thoughtful, considerate, and completely uninterested in my money except as a tool for helping others. Whatever he wanted to talk about, I trusted it would be something good. That evening, as I dressed for dinner in a beautiful dress I'd bought simply because I loved the color, I caught sight of myself in the full-length mirror in my bedroom. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the exhausted factory worker who'd once begged her son for a place to sleep. This woman stood straight and tall. Her hair was professionally styled, her skin glowed with the health that comes from not being constantly stressed about money, and her eyes held a confidence that came from knowing her own worth. As I fastened the pearl necklace Victoria had left me, one of many beautiful pieces I'd discovered in her jewelry collection, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. A year ago, I believed my value came from what I could give to others, how much I could sacrifice, how useful I could make myself to people who didn't appreciate me. Now I understood that my value was inherent. It didn't depend on my bank account balance or my ability to solve other people's problems or my willingness to accept poor treatment in exchange for scraps of affection. Victoria had given me more than money. She'd given me the freedom to discover who I was when I wasn't busy being what everyone else needed me to be, and that woman, the real Eleanor Winters, was someone I genuinely liked. My phone buzzed one final time as I prepared to leave for dinner. Another message from Damien. I know you'll never forgive me. I just want you to know I realize what I lost. I'm sorry.
For the first time in months, I typed a response, I forgive you, Damien. But forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. I hope you find the happiness you're looking for, but you won't find it through me. Take care of yourself. Then I blocked his number permanently. As I drove toward town to meet Robert, I rolled down the windows and let the evening air wash over me. I had no idea what he wanted to discuss, but I knew that whatever it was, I'd face it as a woman who understood her own worth, and that made all the difference in the world. Sometimes the greatest gift isn't getting what you always wanted, it's discovering you never needed it in the first place. I'd spent 28 years trying to earn love I thought I had to purchase. Now I was surrounded by people who loved me for free, and that was worth more than all of Victoria's millions combined. 2 more compelling stories are just a click away if this one drew you in. Wait until you see what else we found, ready to explore.